Welcome to a survey of management theory and applications. Herein, we will go over the different types of entities that we may manage. We may manage inanimate entities like portfolios of stock companies and inanimate assets like land. Since manage emanates from manus or hand and has a historical connection with managing horses, what do you think of managing animals or cattle or horses? Lastly, what do you think of managing peoples? To inform your ideas on managing peoples, let us look at some contrasting historical thought and juxtapose them to see how we may better manage peoples. To begin, we will go over early and seminal thought leadership of the pre-Christian cleric and philosopher Plutarch, whose thoughts influence people even today. So Plutarch quotes Xenophon and says, "A sensible man will receive profit even from his enemies." You see, Plutarch, in an attempt to mitigate hostilities and encourage amity, cast enemies as exploitable, profitable resources. Compare this and contrast it with the teachings of the preeminent influence in the modern world, Christ, who said, "Love your enemies." Again, do not exploit them or profit from them, but love them. Plutarch said also regarding management of people that if you don't have any enemies, you cannot have any friends. The luminary of his age, Plutarch mentioned in his Moralia, such a stark view. Obviously, in modern times, we all just want friends and we do not want any enemies. However, we can afford to think so because of the sacrifices of people like the prophets and Jesus Christ, and even thanks to theologians, philosophers, and historians like Plutarch. Plutarch also said that we may use our enemies to benefit us by looking at the fault finding of our enemies, which makes us prudent, circumspect, careful, cautious, wary, vigilant. He says, "It is peculiar to vice to be more afraid of our enemies than friends in regards to our faults." Obviously, modern, rational, humane, even Christian and Abrahamic thought would encourage us to improve ourselves, not through fear of your opponents, but to improve ourselves for the love of our friends and our lovers and all that is good. So we have looked at some contrasting views on managing peoples. Let's look at various entities that we may manage, like lands, animals, and peoples. Let us look at some examples of good and improper management so we may learn from it and improve our own methods. Firstly, let's begin with good land management examples. There's an injunction that asks the cultivators to leave the land fallow every few years. This injunction to let the land remain fallow so as to avoid over cultivating and depleting fertility of the land and is an example of good land management. Next, let's look at some good management of animals, animate life forms, but not people. There are instructions to treat animals well, do not abuse them or exploit them. Ideally, set them free in their own open ranges instead of killing animals, abusing animals, and owning them as pets or emotional support receptacles. When it comes to managing people, we have an example of injunctions like do not extort interest from a fellow citizen, forgive their debts after 7 years. This is an example of people management, and it is good. It would be nice to also point out that this law about forgiving debts after 7 years is still in practice within the legal and financial systems of the United States, for instance. Now let's look at some improper land management so we may better learn from them and improve our own practices. Some examples of improper land management is destroying and salting the earth of a conquered peoples so that the salted earth becomes forever barren and becomes a desert. This ought to be obvious to people in modern times as improper management. However, you may want to love your enemies instead of salting their soil. One too many instances of human history involves unkindness towards animals. In fact, one of the reasons why we have carnivorous animals like lions and tigers is because after the fall from Eden, humans used animals in their conflicts, and after weaponizing animals, they set them loose, unfortunately, into the wild. Fortunately, scripture and prophecy predicts that the lion will once again eat hay, the tiger will lay in peace with the lamb, and none will hurt upon God's holy mountain. An example of improper management of peoples is pushing people into vices by corrupting them, pushing them into drugs or alcohol or alternative sexual behavior. And there are, of course, instances of much worse corruptions and much worse mistreatment of human beings. Unfortunately, it would be interesting to note that A corruption of the peoples was a charge leveled against Socrates, who was accused of this exact same crime, unfortunately, for which the Athenians suffered greatly for millennia for falsely accusing Socrates of this particular crime. When it comes to managing people, here's something you may want to remember. You may mismanage inanimate assets like property, lands, a portfolio of stocks, even companies, and even some cattle to a limited extent. But please understand that mismanaging or hurting life forms like animals or people is the most expensive form of mismanagement because it can harm subsequent peoples for generations. So kindly be prudent about how you manage peoples and life forms, please. Now we will go over good and improper management techniques in various industries and sectors. The first subsector within the medical industry is that of pain management. Presently, pain management is mostly palliative through the use of anesthetics and painkillers. The idea is to treat the root cause of the pain and to cure pain, particularly chronic pain, as opposed to engaging in masking of the symptoms. Another area of medicine that needs reform is disability management. Presently, we provide palliative care with the aid of plastic or metal prosthetics, crutches, braille, sign language, wheelchairs, and an accessibility culture. The idea is to entirely heal and restore limbs, eyesight, speech, and hearing the way the prophets did, like Elijah, Elisha, Jesus Christ, Moses, and Muhammad. These prophets and many more would have limbs regrown instead of providing people with prosthetics. They would entirely heal the eyes and renew the very tissues of the eardrums so the deaf may hear instead of providing them with hearing aids. The next area that needs successful management or reform is that of race creation or race harm. Presently, and particularly through most of human history, people were oft stigmatized, branded, and their skin darkened and their features softened and their hairs darkened and curled through heat as punishment. Historically, people were banished to hot climes where they would suffer mutation from UV radiation and become permanently tanned, thereby creating an entirely different race of peoples. The solution, of course, is to reverse damage done to the peoples, to give up these idolatrous practices, and to give the peoples fairness, beauty, health, holiness, instead of the darkness of ashes. Another area of society that we may need reform in is how we manage freedom. In the past, people who refused to pay their debts or refuse to engage in combats to the death, were enslaved or imprisoned or worse. The idea is to emancipate slaves, abolish slavery, deliver people of possessions that are unholy, and to deliver people of immorality, and to put an end of viewing people as possessions of one another. Lastly, there are areas of finance which may need reform. Presently, we have a system which penalizes misbehavior with financial penalties and rewards for compliance, as well as financial gains like bounties for being compliant and conformist. Ideally, we would like to deliver people of financial controls and give everyone financial freedom, as is prophesied in the metaphorical saying, may everyone sit under their own vine and their own fig tree, and may none be afraid. The conclusion is that management is the art of handling entities and promoting general felicity and wholeness. Although it has its origins in managing cattle or horses, it is important to remember that when managing peoples, we do not dehumanize them or look down upon the science and art of management as unfit for human use. These things we shall go over in the upcoming lectures.